Hello, I'm Dr. Pedram Shojai. You may know me from one of the documentaries Vitality, Origins, and Prosperity, or one of my books. What you're about to see is something way too big for any one documentary or podcast. We've discovered an entire universe right under our noses, which holds information that could bring us back to vibrant health and possibly cure many of the diseases we suffer from. In our rapid advances in medicine, we inadvertently traded acute infectious disease with a new epidemic of chronic disease. Our lifestyles have changed and many have blamed modern living for this fallout, but there's something we've missed. The extinction of bacterial species and the compromise of our healthy bacteria may have much more to do with this rise in chronic disease than we once thought. Today, we continue to explore this. Antibiotics have saved lives, no doubt about it. But we now know that we may have gone too far in overprescribing them, and we're currently facing a baby in bathwater situation. It's not just in the drugs, but in our foods, pesticides, hand soaps, and much more. Let's dive into this first segment and learn about the problem, one we all face.
The first real discovery of antibiotics was penicillin in 1928, but it was very hard to purify and it wasn't really available. And then sulfa drugs came in the 1930s, and they were good, but they didn't have the full potency. And it was with World War II that the U.S. government and the British government decided we better look into this penicillin, and they developed a project to create large amounts of penicillin, and that very much helped the war effort. And then once it was clear that antibiotics could save lives, in the next 5 years was called the golden age of antibiotics. Many new classes of antibiotics were discovered, classes that we're still using today.
Well, there's about 24 million pounds of antibiotics prescribed every year in America. 19 million are used for animals, not for treatment of disease, but for prevention and also for growth. They actually cause animals to grow faster. Just like humans who take antibiotics often get obesity.
Could you speak to kind of the volume of antibiotics that are being prescribed and what that does to the gut flora? Just keep knocking it back down on the canvas kind of thing.
We are exposed to enormous amounts. I think there's a movement in medicine to start to restrict and dial back our use of antibiotics for every little sniffle and cold. We understand the damage now that's been done. We understand the bacterial resistance that occurs. We now have probably 90,000 people a year dying from antibiotic resistance in drugs. And so we have to sort of rethink our whole approach to this. And we have to also understand how to apply antibiotics appropriately and use gut restoration after to help bring people back into balance.
Nature is about competition, and microbes are competing with each other. Bacteria are competing with fungi, et cetera, and they all have tools. They have chemicals designed to inhibit the other guy. And antibiotics are derivatives of those chemicals, in which, in the case of penicillin, a mold creates a compound that inhibits bacteria. And by definition, an antibiotic is something produced by a living form. So it's something one life form is producing against another. We haven't discussed this, but one of the problems about using so many antibiotics is that we begin to select for bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics, and bacterial resistance has gone up enormously.
We had the antibiotic revolution happen where they showed that penicillin can fight infections. It would change the world for infections. And we've never really shifted out of that. We're still anti-bugs. So we want to get exposed to bugs, and the more bug exposure we have, or pathogen exposure we have that doesn't kill us, the more diverse our gut becomes and the healthier it becomes. So I think in the future we're probably going to have to use gut bacteria and different pathogens to fight infections, which is already happening in the field of antibiotic resistance.
For me, I was 11 years old, I believe, at the time, and I had abdominal pain, and unfortunately my father was a doctor, but he was a psychiatrist, and so my abdominal pain lasted 2 days until I finally passed out. I was taken to the hospital and my appendix had ruptured. Back in those days, they would open you up for surgery, take out the pus from the broken appendix, then open you back up 2 days later to take out the actual appendix. Everything did pretty well. I got amazing amounts of antibiotics. The second surgery didn't go well. They nicked a vein and I started to bleed out and was in the hospital for almost 2 months. I was given every antibiotic that they possibly could have to stop the infections that I had. When I left the hospital, I was never the same. Whenever I would exercise, I would have diarrhea. And I became a high school star standout, college, even professional soccer player. I could not eat on game day because if I ate any food on game day, I'd have diarrhea that would last 20 minutes at halftime, but halftime only lasts 5 minutes, so I'd miss the second half. So I went and saw a natural doctor and talked to me about healing the microbiome, using glutamine, zinc carnosine, and really using the natural supplements that help to heal the lining of the gut, then restore the microbiome. She talked about it as a Brazilian rainforest, how you had to have the ferns and the orchids, and you couldn't just have the weeds. There was this mystery thing called candida that lived there that was supposed to be there, but with a lot of antibiotics, it can get an overgrowth. The more I learned about functional medicine and about integrative and personalized medicine, I realized how much the microbiome really does tell us what's going on. With the microbiome, a lot of people think you should take probiotics when you take antibiotics. It's a good idea, but you can't take them together. If you take an antibiotic at the same moment you take a probiotic, you cancel them out, you cancel each other out. So you've got to separate your probiotic by several hours from your antibiotic. So again, I'm not anti-medicine, I'm appropriate medicine, but also supporting the body with it.
The use of antibiotics and the overuse and then the appropriate use of that. What's your take on that, and how does it fit into how you look at gut health?
I think that one of the main reasons for most chronic diseases that we've experienced the rise of in the last few decades is due to overuse of antibiotics. But it's more than that. There's also lots and lots of preservatives that are added to most foods. If you go to the non-organic section of foods, even if they're canned or jarred, there's majority of the foods have some sort of a preservative. And a preservative is a nice way of saying an antibiotic. A preservative kills bacteria. That's what it does. It prevents bacterial growth. So if you ingest that, even though it doesn't kill you, it'll wipe out specific bacteria or many, many different kinds of bacteria in your gut microbiome. And so overuse of antibiotics and preservatives have caused us to lose. Remember, the fight for presence, for existence in the gut microbiome is already harsh. They're all competing against each other. Now you add antibiotics and preservatives, and now you're enabling riddance of many of the bacterial species. So if we look at the diversity of our gut and compare it to people who live in primitive jungles or third world countries, we have a vastly a reduced composition of bacteria. And so if we go back and remember that our body depends on the production of certain biochemicals by the bacteria, and we are missing those bacteria, then we don't get that benefit.
When your kids are sick early on, that's our immune system training and building up and getting stronger. And not that we wish illness on our kids, but giving a child an antibiotic for a viral ear infection really does a significant amount of damage, particularly a young child under 3 when the microbiome is still forming. And that's not something that we can fix by giving them a probiotic or giving them yogurt. That's something we can fix by not giving them the antibiotic in the first place and allowing their immune system to strengthen. So this idea, again, that we can take antibiotics for non-life-threatening conditions that are mostly viral and self-limited and will go away, but we're going to have to suffer a little bit through it. We're going to have to be a little bit uncomfortable so that we can avoid being uncomfortable even for a minute by taking a drug, and then we can take another medication to mitigate the effects of that drug. That's not how it works. So sometimes we have to be willing to be uncomfortable. We have to suffer through a cold, sinus infection, etc., so that we can safeguard our microbes. It's really this idea of immediate gratification, and we as physicians are guilty, and our patients are guilty. Everybody wants a quick fix, and everybody wants this idea of something we can hack. And again, it really, in my estimation as a practicing gastroenterologist who is both inside people's colon and also sitting in front of them, hearing about the problems they're suffering from, it really can't be done.
I know that it's hard to draw parallels between animal models and humans, but are we seeing the same, and is there enough evidence to suggest that our overuse of antibiotics has also led to immunocompromise in that same kind of vein?
I think there are plenty of scenarios that we can point to now and say, okay, now we understand why Candida grows up in the mouth in someone who has had an antibiotic or recent immune suppression, or Candida grows up in the vagina in the wake of an antibiotic. That's a common consequence of antibiotic use in women. And likewise, other kinds of intestinal infections where hosts, humans, are ill or impaired because they're malnourished or have a damaged ecosystem from previous bouts of infection. Those are the situations in which now a new infection takes hold much more easily.
The average American can ingest up to 120 grams of antibiotics per year in their food. And so, it's not just I took a Z-Pak for my cold, it's I'm eating a very low dose of erythromycin in my food every day for the last 10 years. And then on top of that, with the pesticides and herbicides in the non-organic foods, those are also kind of like antibiotics, you can think of them as, because they're supposed to kill stuff. Not only do they kill the bacteria in the gut, because we see the residues on the foods that we ingest, the bacteria in which the plants themselves live, their microbiome, the soil microbiome, is different. And broccoli that is in organic soil, not exposed to these bad chemicals, is different than organic broccoli that has not been exposed to any of those things. The plant itself is different, and perhaps the health benefits from that plant itself is different. And so it's a very complex situation we've gotten ourselves into as human beings on this planet in order to try to produce more food for more people. As to our detriment, we are harming ourselves. Antibiotics are very helpful when we're very sick and we need them. Part of the reason why antibiotics are becoming problematic in treating conditions and why we have the development of these superbugs that are resistant to antibiotics is because of overuse of antibiotics. Oftentimes people want a quick fix, and they may have a viral infection and they go to the doctor and they want an antibiotic because they think that that's what's going to make them feel better. And maybe they will get better in 3 to 5 days. And probably that's more so because the infection ran its course rather than the antibiotic having done anything. And it's just when we do that chronically, over and over again, we're really killing the good bacteria. And those bacteria are very important in managing inflammation and helping detoxify our bodies and keeping us healthy. And when we're continually shoveling them away, then we're opening ourselves up to having more chronic disease.
So knowing what I know now about the microbiome and personal experience, as I told you, I travel well over 100,000 miles each year. And I go to some countries and I'm perfectly fine, and I go to other countries and I get sick. And I've been on long-term courses of antibiotics, and I know that these things insult the microbiome without a doubt. But I think that trying to consume foods that are fresh or grown by yourself, and trying to maintain a healthy lifestyle, including walking and movement, I think that goes a long way to your health as we're starting to understand exactly what the microbiome is. Luckily, in my opinion, I think the study of the human microbiome has created tremendous opportunities globally to understand these bugs and what they mean and what they do and how they contribute to different diseases. I think the possibility of coming up with novel diagnostics and therapeutics is just unbelievable. If you take, for example, something as simple as a urinary tract infection, we're still culturing these organisms, and hopefully we'll get to a point where if somebody has a urinary tract infection, you could sequence right away, look at the microbes that are there, and figure out the correct antibiotic to administer. But coupled to that, I think the use of broad-spectrum antibiotics has pushed pressure on microbes to develop resistance. And so we're seeing an increase in resistance organisms globally. And, this is a phenomena that we just all need to be aware of, because we've just used so many antibiotics. It's so easy to get antibiotics anywhere you go. There are some parts of the world you can just buy them over the counter. And they get into our waterways, they get into the animal production system, and they're causing, microbes are smarter than us a lot of the time, and they figure out how to evade pressures that are being put on them. And this is what we're seeing in terms of this emergence of antimicrobial resistance and new pathogens globally. And I seriously think it's an area of concern that's not getting as much attention as it should.
It's interesting. When I was going through training back in the early 1990s, we figured if any bacteria, fungi, anything was out in our body, we would call that cellulitis and an infection, and we would need to treat it with antibiotics. And now you fast forward 20 years, 25 years later, and suddenly we're in a reality where the only thing that guarantees disease is sterility. If you have a sterile piece of tissue that doesn't have any bacteria or fungi interacting with it, you've probably got a disease process there. One of the most profound ways to demonstrate this, kind of emerging understanding and belief systems about the role of the microbiome is look at the antibiotic prescription rates state by state in the United States and our death from cancer. And you can go to the CDC and you can find these maps, Centers of Disease Control. And it was a New England Journal of Medicine article that came out in 2011 that really well documented state by state where we prescribe the most antibiotics. And if you overlay the same year, 2011, of our cancer death in the United States with the amount of antibiotic, it's state-by-state correlation. The more prescriptions per 1,000 men, women, and children given in that state increases linearly the amount of cancer death in that state. And so this is a look at kind of what's happening in the greater organism. What is that greater environment that you talk about above the ground? It looks like antibiotics these days. We're steeped in it. 7.7 million pounds of antibiotic a year are prescribed in the United States. Not prescriptions, pounds, And so 7.7 million pounds equates to 833 prescriptions per 1,000 man, woman, and child in the United States. So you've got 83% of the population by numbers being exposed to an antibiotic from their doctor in a year.
I had a little girl who had very severe autoimmune disease, which was called mixed connective tissue disease, and she had itis of everything. She had arthritis, she had dermatitis, she had hepatitis, her blood cells were affected, her blood vessels were inflamed, she had vasculitis, and she was on high dose of steroids and methotrexate and prednisone, these very powerful immunosuppressive drugs. It turned out she had tons of antibiotics early on. She had a lot of sugar in her diet. She'd eaten a lot of tuna and sushi, which affects the gut microbiome, and the mercury from that. And she was able to get better completely by eliminating inflammatory foods that cause leaky gut, like gluten and dairy. We got her off sugar. We restored her gut microbiome with getting her on antifungal, probiotics, vitamin D, and fish oil. And she completely recovered. After 2 months, she was symptom-free. After a year, all her blood tests were completely normal. 10 years later, and she's doing great by simply fixing her gut.
I think the use of antibiotics has got a overly bad rap. Yes, we want to stop the practice of indiscriminate use of antibiotics. I've had a cold for 4 days. I want it gone sooner. Give me a Z-Pack. Yes, that needs to stop. Clearly, that's bad. But antibiotics do help, and they can be very helpful in certain conditions. It's just we need to be more discriminating in our use of antibiotics. The population that's at most risk from use of antibiotics are children. Especially up to the age of 3 or 4, your microbiota is still forming. And the data does show that the earlier you administer an antibiotic to a child, the more detrimental it may be later in their life, even in their teens and 20s and 30s. So there is a long-term impact because it impacts the colonization of the bacteria in your gut, which affects your immune system for the rest of your life. Now, if you have a child with a life-threatening or potentially life-threatening illness, use the antibiotic, right? That's a no-brainer. But don't use them willy-nilly or indiscriminately.
Someone takes antibiotics. What's your protocol to get them back up and running?
It can depend on how long they've taken the antibiotics and for what and which kind of antibiotic it is. So it's never, as in always, it's never a one-size-fits-all, right? But generally while they're taking antibiotics, I have them take them during the day, and I have them take probiotics at night. I have them avoid sugars and refined carbs in general, but certainly don't want to feed fungal overgrowth or other types of bacterial overgrowth while their system's being disrupted. And then when the antibiotics are over, we continue that with the fermented foods, the probiotics, and the healthy diet that's low in sugar. And also tell them to go get out in the dirt or get their dog to lick them or something. My dogs will do that if they don't have one, gladly. But I think, it's just remembering that the ecosystem can be massively shifted even in a day or two of taking antibiotics. But the flip side of that is that we can shift it back, right? So it's understanding the levers that we have to pull.
It's really about restoring balance. And that can mean putting the yeast on the back burner, forgetting about the yeast for a moment, and thinking about repopulation. So I'm always stressing repopulation over eradication. And the problem is that when you're trying to eradicate something, whether it's a fungal organism or a parasite or whatever it is, you're often eradicating more of the helpful bacteria. So repopulation and rebalancing, it's really just about crowding out some of the less helpful species. And the same is true for diet. It's not that, you know, a slice of pizza is going to kill you. It's the lack of healthy, indigestible plant fiber that is the problem for most people. So the same thing with diet. Rather than being obsessive about never eating gluten, dairy, sugar, etc., I always want to know, well, how many vegetables are you eating? Are you getting up to 6 to 8 cups of leafy greens a day? Because it's about feeding the gut bacteria that are there rather than starving the ones that you're trying to get rid of.
I think this awareness is spreading through medicine really well. And I think, again, doctors, while, you know, in my training, you are given somewhat of a limited tool set with prescriptions for drugs and referrals to specialists, especially in primary care. The intentions are pure as far as I see them. And I think what's so exciting about functional health is giving doctors more tools in their tool basket. Because if I can tell you, listen, an antibiotic isn't appropriate right now, but here's a food you can eat or a supplement you can take or something that can help you feel better quickly but isn't going to have some of these negative side effects of antibiotics, great. And that way we can do what we're supposed to do, which is reserve antibiotics for when they are really needed, which they're fabulous tools and we're so lucky to have them, right? It's not about no antibiotics, but it's about really massively reducing their utilization and doing other things first, because often the body can heal.
As a world, we are fascinated by bacteria, right? We spend billions and billions of dollars a year buying probiotics, buying the good probiotics. And yet we also spend billions of dollars a year trying to kill the bacteria. With pesticides, we are, wiping our countertops. We are doing everything that we need to do to stay healthy, but this dichotomy has created a mess. And if bacteria, it's like this double-edged sword. Bacteria is the reason why we are alive, right? It helps us metabolize our foods, keep our skin clean. Bacteria is also the reason why we die.
Pathogens and the gut bacteria we have help us in some way. So if we look at what's being done with antibiotic resistance, the FDA approval right now to treat antibiotic resistance with some of these bacterial species is to do fecal transplants. Now remember, this bias against pathogens happened when they start developing the antibiotic. But one of the earliest Nobel Prize winners, Yushkinov, got the Nobel Prize by showing that probiotics in dairy help fight infections. And he was looking at a population in Russia where they had very little infections that were healthier, but they were eating high amounts of prebiotics and probiotics and things that really help their gut colonize fermented types of cheeses and milks and foods and things like that.
Are there other correlations that you can kind of think of in terms of antibiotic use and kind of sequelae, other diseases that we're now seeing?
Well, there have been big epidemiologic studies linking antibiotic use and colon cancer. Increased risk of colon cancer. Antibiotics taken decades earlier, breast cancer. There have been studies, 2 big studies, each of more than 1 million people, one in Denmark, one in England, linking antibiotic use and eventual development of type 2 diabetes. When's the last time a doctor who gave you an antibiotic said, this might increase your risk of diabetes? But the evidence is moving in that direction. The big study was just published about antibiotic use increasing risk for kidney stones, maybe doubling it. Antibiotics as remotely as 5 years prior. The hypothesis is that the antibiotics are changing the ecology in the gut. They're changing the metabolism and the way that these bugs handle oxalate. We know that antibiotics can eliminate this organism, oxalobacter, as collateral damage. If you have a sore throat and the doctor gives you an antibiotic, that antibiotic is affecting all areas of your body. And people weren't aware of the collateral damage, but it's becoming more and more appreciated.
The Industrial Revolution combined with a discovery of antibiotics, I think that was one inflection point. That is where majority of the deaths we used to have based on infectious diseases were gotten rid of. And so since that time, since the early 1920s, the population growth has exploded. It has enabled all these wonderful discoveries. But then this overuse of antibiotics has now caused these chronic diseases where we're now, the chronic disease burden is so vast and it's affecting entire cultures, entire economies, people's lifestyles. And so now really the next frontier is let's get back to the old times where we had fine-tuned physiology and we lived in tune with the natural world, but we also have the power of antibiotics when needed. And so what we really need to do is only use antibiotics when needed, for the amount of the time needed, for the specific pathogen that they're supposed to target, and then let's figure out how we can recover the diversity of the gut microbiome soon after those antibiotics are used, and that way we can restore that natural balance.
In a world where the mentality has been kill the germs, it's been an interesting challenge to now realize that good bacteria might actually be helping fight infections for us. The idea that these antibiotics may be associated with the rise in obesity, diabetes, and even cancer is sobering, to say the least. Here are some key takeaways from this segment. Antibiotics kill beneficial bacteria along with the pathogens you're trying to wipe out. This approach is obviously causing lots of harm. Much of our antibiotic exposure is actually through food and pesticides and not the pills we take on occasion when we're sick. The higher use of antibiotics in a state, the higher rate of cancer per capita. This is a stunning statistic, which perhaps means we're looking at cancer through the wrong lens. What if the wholesale killing of microbial life is leaving us susceptible to bacteria that create a pro-cancer environment? Probiotics are not a magic bullet that simply wipe out the negative effects of antibiotics. It's a step in the right direction, but certainly not what the supplement companies claim. Allow 2 hours in between taking your antibiotic and a probiotic, or they'll cancel each other out. This is important wisdom to heed at all times. We'll get right back to this episode in just a second, but I wanted to take a quick moment to tell you about how you could own the entire series. Below this video, you'll see a link to the full Interconnected documentary series and a number of powerful bonuses for a one-time special discounted price. This includes our comprehensive natural antibiotics guide, which is filled with safe and effective alternatives for antibiotics for most minor infections. Plus, we've put together a number of other resources that'll help you restore and replenish and rejuvenate your microbiome at home. This is our free gift to you when you invest in the full package during this launch period. Now remember, the power to heal begins within, so if you're interested in harnessing the incredible power of your own microbiome, or if you want to share this groundbreaking information with your friends and family, go ahead and click on the link below. Plus, the proceeds from your purchase will help us on our quest to share this information with the world so we can counteract some of Big Pharma's propaganda. There's no risk, just a very real opportunity to help yourself on this limited time discount. Click the link below, and don't worry, it'll open up a new window so you can do all that while you're watching this show. Let's get back to the episode. Probiotics are species of bacteria and yeast that we've identified as helpful to overall microbiome resilience. They've gotten a lot of attention lately, but not all of it is sound science. There's been a rush by supplement companies to sell on big promises, but the science doesn't support all their claims. That said, patients and functional medicine doctors swear by them. Let's have a look.
I mean, we're in the infancy of our understanding about probiotics and the microbiome. And historically, there has been good data looking at using various strains and various probiotics in clinical trials to show benefits across a spectrum of diseases. Is it enough? No, we need more data. But clearly, they work. The question is, which product, how much, how do you take it? These are sort of things that are still in process. We also are on the verge of much bigger discoveries in how to be targeted with probiotics, how to use specific ones for different things, how to apply them in a smart way. Now, we're not quite there, but we will get there. And I think there's great evidence for me, just clinically using it in my patients, seeing the benefits and how they work over time to help people normalize gut function.
Probiotic is a concept. It's a concept that you can take a microbe and it will improve your health. But the reality is that there are hundreds of products on the market today, hundreds, maybe thousands, that vary in which bugs, what formulations, what are the doses, what combinations. Some of them have been tested, they aren't even alive, even though the label says they are. So it's a completely unregulated field. So to say probiotic is like saying, what do you think about animals? Because there are so many different kinds of animals.
I see a lot of doctors, including myself, who were like, okay, you were low in this probiotic, take this probiotic. Or you have this overgrowing, let's get rid of it, let's kill it. Or you have this yeast overgrowing, let's get your immune system to basically keep it at bay. But we weren't thinking of this bigger picture of why and how are these things surviving? How are they fed? How does one's waste product lead to food for the other one, And it's just mind-blowing how little we actually do know even today.
We don't quite know yet which probiotics, which particular bacteria, are going to help in what conditions, okay? But what do I say? I say, generally speaking, we regard probiotics as do no harm, Ultimately, very few of us as doctors who are using them think that if we get the wrong one, we don't think we're going to do any harm. And I feel very comfortable with that. But we don't have to take a probiotic. The most powerful way to change our gut microbiome is by changing what we eat, okay? And there's no risk there. So we can look at the science and see what the science is telling us, that the gut microbiome is critical for many different conditions. And we also know that your diet is the simplest and quickest way to change that. Here's the problem, when we use terms like Mediterranean diet and the paleo diet, there are so many different interpretations of what these things mean. That particular diet had a diverse range of fruits, vegetables, legumes, things that we know contain lots of prebiotic fiber. People are confused between prebiotics and probiotics, and they, what does all this mean? And it's very, very simple, really. Prebiotics are the food that we can take in to feed these microbes, these gut bugs, okay? There's a whole range of different prebiotic foods. We know that some of the top ones are leeks, are onions, are artichokes. These are simple foods. These are cheap foods. These are accessible to every single socioeconomic group out there. And that makes me really happy as a doctor that some of these recommendations, and I have worked in some of the poorest communities in the UK, and these guys can afford leeks, onions, garlic, artichokes. They are not expensive. So these are the prebiotic foods that generally we're talking about, okay? It's those colorful fiber-based foods that actually feed the microbiome. When we talk about probiotics, we're actually talking about live bacteria or a live microorganism, because there are some probiotics that are yeast, that we can introduce into our gut that are going to have a beneficial effect, okay? And we don't think that those probiotics, when we introduce them, actually stay there, okay? It's not as if we're giving you that good bacteria, or that so-called good bacteria, and it's now going to take up residence. That's what we used to think. No, these effects are transient. The probiotic will pass through, and as it passes through, it exerts an effect. It changes the terrain, it changes the environment, so it makes it much more likely that those good bugs are now going to have a terrain that is suitable for them to grow. So I think it's really important that people understand that. We're not taking those bugs to replace what's there. They don't actually stay there, but they do pass on a very beneficial effect as they're passing through. So what do? I get people to change their diets. I get them to put a diet rich in prebiotic foods, okay, like leeks, like onions, like Jerusalem artichokes. But also one of my top tips is to eat the rainbow. I always give my patients a rainbow chart. I say, get that chart up on your fridge, okay, and see if you can tick off all those colors each day. And I tell you, look, I'm a father, okay? I've got 2 young kids at home. And we've got a rainbow chart on our fridge, okay? Because I've gamified the gut microbiome with my children. So a few weeks ago, we were sitting around having dinner. So when I'm at home, we'll sit around, have dinner together, and we'll all go through, me, my wife, my kids, how many colors have we ticked off, okay? And I remember dinner so well. My son, right, at the time he was 7 years old, he said, Daddy, I haven't got my red color. I said, well, what are you gonna do, son? So he gets up off the dinner table, he marches to the fridge, opens it, pulls out a red pepper, pulls out the knife, cuts the red pepper in half, and eats it. And he puts his red tick on his charts. Now that taught me a lot, because I thought, he's not eating that because daddy's told him, the red phytonutrient is lycopene. Lycopene is very good for your heart. It'd be really good. Although, I've got to be honest, sometimes I do say that to my son, but that's not why he ate it. He wanted his red tick. And so this game is a simple way that anybody watching this now can start getting themselves, get their partner, get their loved ones, get their children to eat more gut-friendly foods, is by putting a rainbow chart up and getting the whole family involved. If someone's living by themselves, they don't have a loved one, they don't have someone, right, do it with your work colleagues. Do it in conjunction with a community. And I could tell you, this is transformative.
So how to determine what probiotic you need and if you should be on prebiotics or not. Fortunately, it's actually not that complicated, and the majority of cases don't require testing to piece that together, which is another great thing. You don't have to go to your doctor, you don't have to have a bunch of testing done. You can save that money and put it into treatment. And this is what I'm about to explain is what the medical literature really supports. For prebiotics, some people can be improved, but they can also flare others. So how do you navigate that? For people who are symptomatic, especially who have digestive symptoms, gas, bloating, reflux, constipation, diarrhea, they should be more cautious with prebiotics because there's a higher chance of harm in those people with prebiotics. So I recommend starting with other gut interventions first and making one of the last things you do a cautious trial on prebiotics to see if you improve or if you have a negative reaction. Now, a little bit of turbulence from a prebiotic for maybe 3 to 5 days, roughly, is not abnormal. You're a little bloated, you may have large stools, you may have looser stools, that's okay. But if that lasts beyond a week, then it may not be an adjustment reaction, it may be a negative reaction that's never gonna go away. And that's about as complicated as a prebiotic piece gets, I guess, but there's one other fact to mention here, which is fiber is not as important for your gut health as we've been led to believe. Now, I'm not saying that everyone should go on a low fiber diet, but what I'm saying is for someone who notices their gut continually regresses when they eat more fiber, it's okay to eat less fiber. And in my book, I went through a very comprehensive, this was the most painful part of writing my book. I had 157 pages of raw data from studies to sift through, and it was painstaking to go through, but when going through it all, you see that there are an equivalent number of studies showing health benefit from fiber that show no benefit at all. So there's no consistent relationship between increased fiber intake and increased health. Now, regarding probiotics, you also don't need to test for that. There has not been a study done, to my knowledge, and I've read the majority of them, that shows that if you come back low with a certain bacteria on a stool test, that you'll do better if you orally take that probiotic. But what we can do is simplify all of the litany of probiotic products out there into 3 general categories. Category 1, probiotics are a mixture of lactobacillus strains and bifidobacterium strains. So you look on the label, you see lactobacillus acidophilus, bifidobacterium infantis, and you might see 10-ish strains, all lactobacillus something and bifidobacteria something. That's category 1. Category 2, healthy fungus, Saccharomyces boulardii. That's the one ingredient you should see on the back of the label. All right, and category 3 are soil-based probiotics. These are probiotics that are typically designated as bacillus. So it might be Bacillus subtilis, Bacillus coagulans, Bacillus licheniformis. The important thing is look on the label and you'll see mostly bacillus, and typically these soil-based or spore-forming probiotics have anywhere from 1 to 4 strains in them. They've all been studied, all these different categories. They've all shown effect, but it's important to look at the probiotic that you've taken and take stock of, did it help me or did it flare me? Because not everyone will be helped. A small number of people may notice they're a little bit more bloated or they get constipated from a probiotic. It's more rare, but it can happen. But once you can categorize your probiotic into 1, 2, or 3, instead of trying another product that's the same version of that category and having the same negative response, you can say, okay, I tried a category 1, I felt great on that. I tried a category 2, I got a little bit constipated, so I'm not going to use that anymore. And I'll also try category 3 and see how I do. And you can really simplify the probiotic landscape by doing that.
I had gone on a trip to Mexico, and when I came back, nothing was the same. I just could not get comfortable in my body. I had so many abdominal symptoms I don't even want to go into, but I started losing weight. I started seeing doctor after doctor. Initially, they diagnosed me with the parasite, but treating that didn't get anything better. And so I just kept trying to find out what was going on, and kind of gave up on the doctors being able to help me. So I had to start researching myself what might change things. And it turned out that really changing my diet helped, and then doing a lot of integrative approaches. So I went to an allergist, I went to an acupuncturist, I went to a nutritionist, I went to an herbalist. So I finally pieced together the things that I needed to do to help my digestive system to heal. And based on what I know now, I know that those changes that I made significantly shifted what was going on with my microbiome. I eat very carefully. I eat food that I know is going to feed my healthy microbiome and avoid the things that I know are going to disrupt it. And then I meditate every day, because stress is such a big impact on what the bacteria especially do. And then I take probiotics to build up the bacteria that I want to have there.
Are there any kind of antimicrobial supplements that have worked in your experience?
If someone has bloating from fiber, there's a couple of things they consider. Level 1 would be their diet, and a low FODMAP diet would be a consideration. Level 2 would be probiotics, because probiotics can actually help combat some of the inflammation in the gut that can lead to that response, that negative response to fiber. And the probiotics can also kill off overgrowths of bacteria. However, there are also herbal antimicrobials that are directly antibacterial that can be used. These are things like oregano, or alicillin, which is a derivative of garlic, or berberine, or even caprylic acid can be helpful. So this is the wonderful thing about herbal medicines, is they can act antibacterially, antifungally, and also in an anti-inflammatory nature. And oregano, for example, even has some characteristics that make it an antidepressant. Berberine has been shown to lower blood sugar. So at the same time that we're killing off this extra bacteria or fungus, we can also have a side benefit rather than a side effect. It's one of the really nice things about natural medicines.
So the food that we feed our bacteria clearly is the same food that we feed ourselves. And so prebiotics, which are primarily fiber, and then foods that have fermentation associated with them, like kombucha or sauerkraut, those, kimchi, those fermented foods are also very good. And that helps feed and therefore sustain the right bacteria. Then you do a microbiome analysis and you see what's there or what's not there, and you give probiotics to make sure that you are giving the right strand of bacteria, the right type of bacteria. Then you feed the bacteria properly, and that, I think, is really where all health is going. And there's this saying that we use, we are what we eat, or our health is a reflection of what we eat. And I think the next statement that's going to be coming out there is we are what we host, right? We are really going to be, our health is determined by the bacteria that we host in our gut.
I thought we would immediately have, pinpoint precise probiotic prescriptions that would turn around anything. That we would know how to advise people on what to eat exactly to shift ratio here, to drop this organism, to deal with this, pathogen or opportunistic organism. So I really expected us to, be able to get in there and sort of, be the puppeteer, the marionette of our microbiome. And I was humbled pretty quickly when I started to realize that we weren't going to be able to go in and move the chess pieces quite so powerfully. And in fact, my aha moment, my really big aha moment in the lab was realizing again that food was our best medicine, that we needed to chew our food, that we actually needed to pay attention to the evolution of how we receive and consume food, that we needed to sort of think about meal preparation, the cephalic phase of a digestion, and then actually take some time to, prepare and allow the odors to influence sequestering the hydrogens for stomach acid, for the pancreas to kind of prepare enzymes, and, the various sphincters to tighten up. Like, there's this journey of preparing and then receiving food, if we're in a parasympathetic state, that allows us to metabolize and incorporate those micro packets of information in the best way possible.
Probiotics get a lot of love. They also get a lot of hate. A lot of people are like, okay, look, we don't know enough. A lot of the guys in the ivory towers are like, come on, we don't know. But it can't hurt, right? So a clinician on the beat, you're on the front lines, people are suffering, they're coming to you, and you want to help them. So what's your take on the use of probiotics and how much more specificity we're going to get in the next few years, knowing what we're learning?
There's been a number of studies to show that probiotics are effective. So I don't think you can argue with some of those studies that taking probiotics in many instances, asthma, Crohn's disease, can be very beneficial for patients. So I think we can establish that. The key is that they're very nonspecific. To your point is that probiotics currently, the ones that are on the market, are ones that are really easy to grow. And so those tend to be the ones that make it into products that we can take. So we can definitely use those. I think over time we're going to get much more specific, and that each individual's microbiome is going to require different probiotics. But in addition to probiotics, I think the even more powerful intervention is going to be what we call microbiome modulators. So how do we take the microbiome and feed it what it needs to really thrive? How do we create the milieu that it's going to really, that ecosystem is going to really grow and be beneficial? Things like polyphenols, things like other components that we get in our diet, in addition to the probiotics, I think are very powerful, and we really need to look at using those more.
The fascinating thing, is that, wow, there's a probiotic that can lower your cholesterol, that, how fascinating that cardiologists should be, looking at the microbiome. Wow, the liver, internal medicine, there's things you can take if you have, for example, autoimmune encephalopathy. So if your liver basically is not functioning well and it affects your brain, they found that there's a probiotic strain you can take down the inflammation around the brain, and so it's just powerful. They really are powerful. I mean, these guys have been around way longer than we have. For us to think, or for me to think after 12 years of practice that somehow I'm smarter and more intelligent, it's just ego. These bugs have mutated and been around for so long. And they're smart. They're much smarter than we are. So really, I feel like we're always in awe and learning. And it's fascinating.
We're learning that gut health is far more complicated than simply popping a pill, grabbing a random probiotic at the store and thinking we're covered. The science is giving us deep insight into the activity of particular strains, but it's important to understand that nothing happens in isolation. The overall makeup of the microbiome will determine how individual strains express. That means the overall ecology of the gut, who your microbial neighbors are and what they're up to, will determine how individual players will act. These bacteria feed on fiber, so simply popping a pill without the diet to support the organisms is far less effective. Here are some of the key takeaways from all this. Here are the major probiotic categories. The first is a mixture of lactobacillus strains and bifidobacterium strains. Number 2, healthy fungi like Saccharomyces boulardii. And 3, the soil-based ones like Bacillus subtilis, Bacillus coagulans, and Bacillus licheniformis. Here's some potent herbal antimicrobials: oregano oil, berberine alkaloids like huanglian or coptis, alicillin, which is derived from garlic, or caprylic acid, and a few fermented foods like kombucha, sauerkraut, or kimchi. In case you're scrambling to take notes, just remember that we have all of these slides with a comprehensive companion guide we've created to go along with the series. We've researched the top natural remedies that fight infection along with the best research on probiotics and supplements. We've created a fermentation guide and much more. Again, it's all yours as part of what you get included when you invest in this series. We've covered why the overuse of antibiotics is a bad thing and how the probiotic promise is more complicated than what the supplement companies are saying. So what's the way forward here? Well, according to our medical experts, it's in the hygiene hypothesis, a way of getting more healthy microbes into our daily life. Our health and survival may be more tied to the earth and the dirt than we ever thought.
Many allergic and autoimmune diseases appear to be rising in Western societies. There are some neurodevelopmental disorders, such as autism, that appear to be rising as well. We don't know exactly what is mediating this increase, but there's a prevailing hypothesis called the hygiene hypothesis, which suggests that cleaner lifestyles, the absence of contact with microbes, may result in certain events, the loss of particular biological activities that then result in disease. And so one can imagine that if the absence of microbes or the reduction in exposure to microbes predisposes to disorders, one can then presume that replacing those missing organisms may be therapeutic options.
Our very sterile and very hygienic environment, which gives us a lot of positives like less parasitic infection and decreased infantile mortality, has a con to it, which is a partially maldeveloped immune system, which makes inflammatory and immune-mediated disorders more common. So it's not just the antibiotics that are leading to this. Yes, we want to be careful in how we use them, but there are patients that will do very well. Let's say they have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth and they use a certain antibiotic for that. They can actually do very well, or an antifungal agent if they have a fungal overgrowth. So we can use them, they can be beneficial, we just don't want to overuse them. And also you can use probiotics synergistically with antibiotics. Many conventional providers are unaware of this, that not only do probiotics prevent negative consequences like diarrhea, which can happen from an antibiotic, but they also can help in some cases the antibiotic work more effectively, because remember, probiotics actually release antibacterial and antifungal agents.
We need to rethink our relationship with the microbes on this planet. I was actually trained as a microbiologist. So when I was in undergraduate school, I worked my way through school working in a microbiology lab. And the whole focus of that was culturing organisms, was trying to find bugs out there that would do us harm. And that's the way we thought about the world of microbes for a long time. It started with this guy, Leeuwenhoek, who invented the microscope. He looked under a drop of water and he saw all these things swimming around. He said, oh my God, there's stuff there we didn't know about. The initial focus was on the things in there that would kill us. And that came about because of the discovery of penicillin. We realized, hey, there are these bugs called strep that will kill us, and we can treat that with an antibiotic. And that created this whole us versus them kind of dichotomy. Intolerance, this whole idea of we cannot tolerate these guys, so we need to isolate them, find out what they are, we need to swab everything, clean everything, sterilize everything. So we began to develop this notion that microbes were mostly bad. And I think we need to completely change that notion. There's some molds that are clearly bad. They're toxic, they can kill you, they can make you feel terrible. And there are other molds that can make you feel really good. In China, they focus on medicinal mushrooms. They sell millions and millions of tons of medicinal mushrooms, of shiitake mushrooms and maitake mushrooms and reishi mushrooms. I believe there was a Dr. Strawn, who was an immunologist in England, that started looking at the data and said, something weird is going on here. We're having this epidemic of allergies and autoimmune disease, etc. And yet you don't see that in third world countries where people live in dirty environments. And you don't see it in people that grew up in farms. What could that be? And so Dr. Strong wrote an article about this, and he really started this whole notion of thinking about what's now called the hygiene hypothesis. One of the major proponents of it is Gerald Rook, and he's still writing about it. He talks about old friends. He says these microbes that are in soil, that are in water, that we're being exposed to most of our lives, they're mostly our friends. They're mostly our friends. And yet, again, we got this notion years ago with the discovery of antibiotics that maybe we should be afraid of these microbes.
The concept of the hygiene theory has really developed in the last 10 to 15 years, and there's no question by scientists anymore. It's accurate, this is how it is. That we've had a phobia about germs. We think germs are bad for us, so we've had antibacterial soaps, antibacterial cleansers, and keeping our kids out of the dirt and all of that. And the result is that we've become more sterile in our bodies, and that has contributed to the increase in all of the autoimmune diseases. Why? Because the microbiome is so far out of balance. You know, if I want to build a bicep, I've got to work it. You got to work it. And our kids have to work their immune system. It's really good that they have a fever once in a while, as long as it's not too high, because it's cleaning out some toxic stuff and they're working their immune system to protect them. So if they get exposed to some really nasty bugs, they've got an immune system that knows how to respond. That's critically important. We can't keep our kids sterile. That's why the incidence of asthma has gone up so high. Recurrent ear infections has gone up so high because the immune system is no longer able to handle the bugs that we're exposed to on a daily basis.
The question of using hand sanitizers on a regular basis and being sterile seemed to be a problem. I mean, obviously, if you're a parent and really worried about your kid getting exposed to a virus or something, I mean, hand sanitizers have an effect on that. But at the same time, if you're constantly neutralizing, you have some problems with how you diversify your microbiome.
I had this gal come in, right? And she's got this little baby. And the baby's just covered in this bunting, right? And it's not that cold. It was like late spring, early summer. And she comes in, and the baby's just totally covered in bunting and just like, totally uncomfortable. And like, man, that's got to be hot for that poor baby. You know, why is she covering this kid up? And you can see the whole hands are covered in the bunting thing. She has it like all covered up. And I'm like, what's going on? She says, yes, I'm here because my child has this incredible case of eczema. Check this out. So she pulls back, beautiful cherub cheeks, pretty kid, pulls back the hoodie and pulls back the hands. And you just see the skin is just blistery and red, just looks awful. And I'm like, oh man, you know, wow, look at that, right? And so the baby starts crying as the mom's moving all this stuff, like uncontrollably. And so the mom's like, hold on just a second, takes out a hand sanitizer, right? And goes on the pinky. It's not even dry. There's a copious amount of hand sanitizer, right? And this is back in the day when triclosan wasn't banned. This is a very potent antimicrobial substance, right? She puts it in the mouth of the baby. Right? So this is her standard of practice. The standard of practice is I need to put a hand sanitizer on the pinky to calm down my baby. And I'm thinking, man, that may have caused the eczema. I mean, this stuff has been known to very clearly eradicate microbes and stay around in the system for a while and stay around in nature for a while. So it's like, whoa, you know, what's the mindset, right? We're all in this hyper vigilant mode of like reduce exposure to bugs, but I had to have a talk with her about, you know, there's something called the hygiene theory, and the hygiene theory implies that if we don't get exposed to bugs, that our body doesn't know how to respond to the environment very well. These bugs are supposed to train our immune system. When they're gone, our immune system hyper-reacts. I think your gut bugs in your child are low, and this is why the system's reacting. She thought I was crazy. Left the office, never saw her again.
One of the most important points I like to make for patients is that this concept of germ theory, Pasteur's germ theory, which is a bad guy gets in and makes you sick, is really not accurate. So I like to explain this in terms of terrain. What's your terrain? What's your gut garden look like? The idea of keeping our children healthy has to do with their terrain. We all know kids who are sick all the time and kids who are never sick. And it has much less to do with what they're exposed to and much more to do with what their terrain looks like, what their gut garden looks like. So the thing that is going to be the most successful at keeping your kid healthy is stuffing them full of green vegetables at home. It's not hand sanitizer or prophylactic antibiotics or keeping them in a bubble. It's actually letting them get out there in the dirt, but making sure that their microbiome is healthy because they're eating lots of indigestible plant fiber. That's a number one thing.
I would say eat dirt. Eat dirt. I think we are way too worried about cleanliness. I love it when something falls on the floor. I grab it and I eat it. I think we have to get dirty. And when you look at the data on this, people who grow up on farms have less asthma, less allergies, less autoimmune disease. When you go to the developing world, those conditions are almost completely absent.
The proponents of the hygiene hypothesis have said we need them when we're first coming into the world. When we come out of the womb, our body depends on the exposure to these old friends to program the immune system. If we don't get that programming of the immune system becomes intolerant. Because everything seems like a foreigner. Everything seems strange. So the immune system tends to overreact to things that it shouldn't overreact to. And as a consequence, we get inflammatory bowel disease. We get ulcerative colitis. We get multiple sclerosis.
Historically, we had a number of changes when we became more urban. And in urban environments, you saw the rise of things like cholera and bubonic plague and tuberculosis because of very poor living conditions. And I think that led to us being very terrified of bugs. And unfortunately, we sort of over-sanitized our world and haven't let our immune systems mature and develop with the exposure to things over time.
The chances that the bugs on the subway handle in New York are very much different than anything that you're already harboring, are very low. So how do you speak to that in terms of like hygiene amongst other humans and all this in public spaces? What do you recommend?
I mean, listen, if someone has a cold, you don't want to shake their hand. I mean, those things are contagious, but those aren't affecting your microbiome. Those are just going to give you upper respiratory infections. If your immune system's suppressed, you're more likely to get it. If you're stressed, you're more likely to get sick from bugs. But I think that from the point of view of bugs that are going to hurt you, it's unlikely you're going to get something just from touching something or somebody. The coevolution of us with parasites and worms and other things have led us to actually be able to handle these things. And when we take these away, our immune system often is looking for trouble rather than fighting those things which we're adapted to. So we start to attack ourselves and end up in a bad situation. So I think the hygiene hypothesis has a lot of merit. And there's a wonderful book called The Epidemic of Absence, which talks about how this has been an issue all over the world, and indigenous cultures don't have these diseases, and we do, and even talking about reintroducing things like worms to treat different diseases. And I've done some of that, which has been fascinating. I've learned from some of the research done by Dr. Parker at Duke using basically rat tapeworms, helminths, that are little tiny non-human target worms, and they regulate, like tourists, the economy of your gut while they're going through, and they reset. I've seen people have dramatic improvements in allergies, in behavioral issues, and autism. It's pretty striking.
There's a lot of science that's pointing to the microbiome being part of this. What's the most exciting piece of this evidence, like the microbiome research that you've seen?
The most exciting thing that I've seen about the microbiome research is that it's the diversity of the microbiome that makes you stronger. The more species of the good, the beneficial, the commensal bacteria that you've got in your body, the stronger you are, the more resilient you are, the less likely you are to have an immune response that triggers the autoimmune mechanisms that will show as whatever the weak link in your chain is. You pull at a chain, it breaks at the weakest link. It's at one end, the middle, the other end. It's your heart, your brain, your liver, your kidneys, wherever your genetic weak link is, that's where the chain's going to break. And so you don't want to pull on the chain. So what does that mean? You want a strong microbiome because it reduces the inflammation, it reduces the pull on the chain throughout your whole body.
When people moved from the countryside to cities in the Middle Ages, we had high population density with no plumbing. We're talking about rats living in human feces and spreading disease. It led to nasty plagues that killed millions. With advances in sanitation and plumbing, much of that went away. Antibiotics then rode in under the same worldview, bombing the enemy and our beneficial microbial allies. We now realize that we've been looking through the wrong lens. The idea of bombing the enemy doesn't work well in our own bodies. Modern medicine owes much of its success to advances on the battlefield. Patching someone up so they could go out and shoot more people in wartime is a different mentality, and it doesn't apply well to today's chronic disease epidemic. A new breed of reputable functional medicine doctors are now telling us to eat dirt and stop using hand sanitizer so much. This is a radical departure from the germophobia of the past couple generations. Let's take a look at some of the key things we learned. You must build your immune system by exposing or training it with beneficial bacteria. Less exposure to germs can leave you more exposed to infection or allergies down the line. Children need to get dirty with germs to stay healthy. However, you still need to avoid viruses and exposure to colds when people are sick. Flu bugs are contagious. Sterility can create a superbug, so the overuse of antibiotics and hand sanitizers is backfiring. Germ theory has been replaced by the hygiene hypothesis. The science is in. Getting dirty and allowing natural bacterial strains to interact with our immunity is good for us. Do you want to bring all of this healing knowledge into your home and help our quest to heal chronic disease? Click the button below this video to find out how you can get the full interconnected documentary series, plus a bunch of powerful bonus resources at a limited time discount price today. And when you purchase, you'll not only have lifetime access to everything you've seen in these episodes in 3 different formats of video, audio, and text transcript, you'll also get comprehensive guides on how to use natural medicine for specific conditions, our home fermentation guide, natural probiotics, and even how to make sure your pet has a healthy microbiome. These extended interviews on these topics are also included in the Platinum set, and that's the director's cut. And these uncut interviews are everything, right? It's everything that we did. We had to cut down to make this. It's everything, all the knowledge. So remember, it's only available at this discounted price during the event. So click the button below now. You have nothing to lose except you're going to get a healthy, vibrant future with the information you gain. We've learned a lot as we've grown and adapted. We've saved lives and have swung too far to the other side. That's how things go. Now we correct the other way and find a way to coexist and thrive with nature while still saving our heavy antibiotics for their intended use. It's all progress. There's something that's fundamentally changed, however, in the past couple generations that's completely new to our species and is causing great harm to our bodies and the microbes we harbor. We've had incredible strides in our understanding of chemistry, but that's led to the creation of billions of pounds of toxic chemicals, which are all around us. The world has become toxic, and in our next episode, we're going to explore the fallout of this and learn what we need to do to protect ourselves from these poisons. Until then, I'm Dr. Pedram Shojai. See you soon.